To the dateline Joyce appended to the end of Ulysses, if truth be told, he should have added Rome to the Trieste, Zurich, Paris, an additional 8 years, 1906 to 1921, because it was in Joyce's ill-fated Roman sojourn that the first ideas for Ulysses surfaced. Joyce would later in life frequently say his book had its beginnings in Rome. The Eternal City, however, would prove to be a prosaic disappointment to Joyce on multiple fronts. But it resulted in his conceptualizing, arguably, the greatest short story ever written in the Dead, and the first glimmerings of a potential story for Dubliners that grew in importance in Joyce's conception as the sequel to Stephen Hero and the epical extension of the Künstlerroman that Joyce was struggling to complete. Ulysses then began as a story in Dubliners, but would take on the weight and extent of something far more expansive and consuming. What it would become lay considerably in the future, but its first possibilities came to Joyce in Rome. Joyce's venturing for the first time into Italy from his Austro-Hungarian residence at Trieste in the summer of 1906 did not go well. Like most of Joyce's get-rich schemes, it was ill-conceived and disastrous as a remedy for Joyce's financial distress. Joyce and company came back to Trieste in spring 1907, penniless and adrift. The plan was to take a position at a Roman bank to relieve the drudgery of his English instruction at the Berlitz School in Trieste and enhance the Joyce family income while increasing Joyce's writing time as he continued adding stories to Dubliners and was wrangling Stephen Hero into completion. Neither would materialize, but Ulysses shadowed forth. Episode 1, Summer 1906. Trieste, Austro-Hungary, Rome, Italy. Joyce's departure with Nora and Georgie for Rome from Trieste on July 31st seemed as much abandoning a sinking ship as grabbing at a lifeline. In Finnegan's wake, Joyce would write, "And Trieste, Trieste ate I my liver." And his on-again, off-again love affair with Trieste was very much by 1906 in The Descendant. Trieste had become the rock upon which Promethean Joyce felt bound and daily devoured. La Nostra Bella Trieste had lost much of its charm on the treadmill of the Berlitz grind and the seemingly constant stinging demands from publisher Grant Richards for more and more cuts, from language to full stories, before Dubliners could be published. Joyce's son was born in June 1905. Joyce's brother joined them in October 1905, to Joyce's great relief, as an additional earner at the Berlitz School and a reliable whetstone for his older brother. However, Stanley came at the cost of an increasingly unhappy Nora, who was burdened with trying to keep afloat a household that always was careening day to day towards collapse. She had to contend with two often morose brothers and her infant son in a tiny flat with scant prospects for a respite. More and more she railed against what exile with Joyce really amounted to, isolation and deprivation, and threatened to take Giorgio home to Ireland. If their home life brought few comforts, Joyce's work at the Berlitz School was in an uproar by the sudden absconding of its director with some of the school's assets. The new director, Almidano Artifoni, informed the Joyce brothers that it would be unlikely that the school would be able to keep 2 English teachers on the payroll during the traditionally lean summer months. Joyce took this as an omen to be gone. Seeing an advertisement in Rome's Tribuna for a bank's correspondence clerk fluent in Italian and English, he applied in early May, securing a recommendation from his pupil, Roberto Precioso, editor of Il Piccolo della Sera, and including, for good measure, the letter of commendation he had secured in 1902 from Timothy Harrington, Lord Mayor of Dublin. By mid-June, he was taken on for a 2-month trial at a salary of 12 guineas a month. This was more than twice his monthly salary of 150 crowns, or £6 a month, from Berlitz. Having little idea what his responsibilities would be as a bank's correspondence clerk, Joyce leaped into the unknown, convincing himself that it had to be better than the drudgery of teaching English. Besides, he wanted to see Rome, and the change of location and prospects might help reset both his life with Nora and his writing fortunes. With the publication of Dubliners hanging fire, Joyce was stalled at chapter 25 of Stephen Hero, The College Days and Aesthetic Theories. A new city might mean a new chapter and a new way forward in finishing the never-ending biographical novel. Besides, he could leave his creditors behind, relying on Stanislaus to placate them as best he could, out of sight, out of mind. Anything was better than being chained to the rock of Trieste, daily pecked at and consumed by publisher, creditors, students, a disapproving brother, and an unhappy partner. On July 30th, 1906, Joyce, Nora, and their 1-year-old son, along with whatever belongings they could carry, traveled by train from Trieste across the Istrian Peninsula southeast to Fiume, now Rijeka, Croatia, before taking the night boat west across the Adriatic to Ancona, the Italian Adriatic seaport city, and finally continuing by train across central Italy to Rome. It was not an auspicious introduction to Bella Italia. Sending a postcard to his brother, Joyce wrote, "Arrived safely in Ancona, filthy hole, like rotten cabbage. Thrice swindled, all night on deck." 12 hours later, a second card confirmed their safe arrival, but very tired, in Rome, and their temporary lodgings near the Spanish Steps. A third card, posted a day after his bank interview on August 1st, delivered the news that his hours would be 8:30 to 12 and 2 to 7:30. Damn long, Joyce commented. 6 days a week. So much for extra time for writing. On August 7th, in a long letter to his brother, Joyce filled in the details of Ancona. "I cannot think of it without repugnance," he wrote. "There is something Irish in its bleak, gaunt, beggarly ugliness. The money changer swindled me out of 2 lire, the cabman out of half a lire, and the railway official out of 3 lire." He relates a rather perfunctory interview with the bank manager. "He wanted to know the age of my father, my age, and was Harrington, the Dublin Lord Mayor, a friend of our families." He would be working in the Italian correspondence department. This work, Joyce wrote, is very easy and mechanical. The atmosphere seemed to him a little more antipathetic than at the Berlitz school. He gives his brother his impressions of the initial sights. St. Peter's did not seem to me much bigger than St. Paul's in London. The music at Mass, nothing much. The neighborhood of the Colosseum, like an old cemetery with broken columns of temples and slabs. He described his amusement and irritation hearing English and American accents in the Colosseum, writing, "It is a relief not to understand the language sometimes," and being pestered by a postcard hawker in broken Cockney and solicitation for a guide. "The cafes," he wrote, "are not as good as any of the best in Trieste, but there were countless little coffee bars. A little Greek restaurant once frequented by Thackeray, Byron, Ibsen, and company is his go-to." The rest of the letter is a complicated set of instructions of who to pay, who to fob off, tell the tailors my address is Edinburgh or Glasgow, and who to collect money from. He closes by saying, "I have now only 100 lira left. However, I know the place a little better now. It is a trifle dearer." Well, if Trieste ate Joyce's liver, Rome pretty much consumed the rest. Rome was not just a trifle dearer. It quickly went through his income, so that by August 16th, 2 weeks at the bank, Joyce had gone through his monthly his salary advance and a reimbursement for travel expenses, and was down to his last 25 lira, with no more expected until the end of the month. By the end of August, Joyce entreats Stanislaus, "If you cannot do something at once to help me over this month, I do not see how I can live." He reports rather ignominiously that 9.5 hours a day sitting on an uncushioned straw-bottomed chair has worn holes in his pants, and I'm quoting, "There are 2 great patches on the seat of my trousers so that I cannot leave off my coat in the office and sit stewing for hours," unquote. To make matters worse, he had heard nothing from Grant Richards after sending the publisher the proposed final cuts to Dubliners the previous month. And the news he does receive from Ireland is both galling and mortifying. He learns from an excited Nora that on the same day of his interrogation by the bank manager, his nemesis, Oliver St. John Gogarty, had been married, marrying a young woman from a prominent family from Galway, no less. Later news comes that Gogarty's mother is beastly dead, leaving her son beastly rich. The papers his Aunt Josephine has sent from Ireland with the matrimonial news are filled with contributions from Joyce's university peers, such as Francis She Skeffington, Thomas Kettle, now an MP, and J.M. O'Sullivan, all of whom, to Joyce's chagrin, are in the public eye and in favor, much to Joyce's envious annoyance. He writes, "And here I am, whom their writing and lives nauseate to the point of vomiting, writing away letters for 10 hours a day, like the blue devil on the off chance of pleasing 3 bad-tempered bankers and inducing them to let me retain my position, while, as a luxury, I'm allowed to haggle for 2 years with the same publisher, trying to induce him to publish a book for which he has an intense admiration. Oreo Dio." Translation, pig god. Self-pity gives way to an incessant cajoling to Stanislaus to send more money. On September 4th, Joyce reports that he is down to 7.5 lira. "In 2 days," he says, "I'll be down to 0. On September 6th, he confirms that he has found a pupil for English lessons, 30 lessons for 50 lira, but they have to be from 8 to 9 every evening. So, Joyce writes, This month, my timetable is rather full. On September 9th, he is forced to admit that Rome is certainly not cheap. A lira goes a very short way indeed here. Send more money is the message. On September 14th, Joyce reports being at the end of my tether with no one to borrow money from and not a chance of an advance on his salary from the bank. His solution? Press Artefoni to get an advance on Stanislaus's salary. And he rather fecklessly suggests that, in a way, it is easy for you, Stanislaus, than for me. You have not to keep up an appearance, and you could hardly want a meal. 2 days later, on September 16th, Joyce writes to his brother, I don't know what the hell I'm to do this time. I can't go beyond Tuesday evening. I have eaten nothing except soup in order to economize. I have 10 lira left. If I receive nothing from you, I have no means of getting any. I can't do miracles. On September 18th, he writes, unless you can telegraph money early on Saturday, I have no means of living. On September 25th, he writes, my assets are 2 centesimi. For Joyce, in the first 2 months of his employment, virtually nothing mattered other than finding funds to keep them afloat. Joyce writes to his brother on September 18th, my leisure is of little use to me and I want money. You cannot imagine I want to continue writing at present. I've written quite enough, and before I do any more in that line, I must see some reason why. I am not a literary Jesus Christ. However, I shall hope that Mr. Grant Richards shall perhaps also hope within a few years to be able to see his way to make some communication to me regarding the unfortunately delayed manuscript, which he admires so profusely. Joyce finally, on September 25th, bit the bullet and wrote to Grant Richards with a commitment to publish. Joyce would even consider soliciting Gogarty for a loan, but not without. He wrote to Richards, I write to you now because I wish that this suspense of mine in which I live at present may come to an end one way or the other. I need scarcely assure you how disheartening it is for me to see, as I see, that yet another season is going by without my book being published. And I think you will not accuse me of being importunate if I ask you to write me definitely on receipt of this letter. Cornered, Grant Richards replied the next day that he could not and would not publish the Dubliners. He writes, you have certainly gone a good ways to meet our objections to it, objections based on other people's prejudices and not on our own, as I have tried to make clear to you. But it still remains of a kind that would not, I think, be successful, that would prejudice the majority of its readers against its publisher, and would stand in the way of your gaining success with any future work. He urged Joyce to send him the manuscript of his first novel, however, and promised a decision within a fortnight of its arrival. If that were published, Richards argues, then Dubliners might follow. Joyce's reaction was retaliation, legal and otherwise. He contacted English critic Arthur Symonds and an international jurist recommended by the English consul. Close to 2 years of effort to get Dubliners published, therefore, had collapsed. Joyce was back to square one without a book deal that would sustain his sense of his value as a literary artist. Joyce closes his letter to Stanislaus reporting this grave news with the even more dire truth that it can only get worse. New item, he writes. The landlady has just raised the rent of our room. How thoughtful. And then, Joyce adds a postscript. I have a new story for Dubliners in my head. It deals with Mr. Hunter. This is the first reference to what would become Ulysses, a story for Dubliners based on the actual Dubliner, Alfred Hunter, allegedly a Dublin Jew with an unfaithful wife, who came to Joyce's aid one night in 1904 when Joyce had drunkenly collapsed. So, amid Joyce's financial despair, when the prospect of Dubliners ever being published was most doubtful, a new story emerges that would change everything. Why? It's never possible to pin down with certainty or conviction the origin of any idea. Things pop in one's head unbidden, and calculating idea causality is something of a fool's game. But it is possible to ask what conditions may have contributed. In other words, what was different in Joyce's life that might have sparked his idea? The obvious answer is that Rome happened. Joyce frequently reported that Ulysses originated in Rome. Why is the question to consider. Joyce certainly was dealing with financial distress throughout his Roman residence, but that was hardly new. Robbing Peter to pay Paul was economic standard practice for Joyce in Trieste. What was different in Rome was that Joyce was on his own, in effect on probation at the bank, where he didn't dare pester his bosses for advances. He also did not have a selection of pupils who he might have approached for advances for lessons. With few options other than his long-serving brother, Joyce even considered approaching Gogarty, but only if he had Dubliners set for publication, so it would be an advance on certain future earnings, and Grant Richards removed that possibility. Without the same resources and options as in Trieste, the financial stress for Joyce in Rome was far more desperate. Isolated and alone in Rome with schemes for rescue a constant preoccupation, was this the reason Joyce thought of the night in Dublin that he had collapsed from drink and was assisted by passerby Alfred Hunter, an acquaintance of Joyce's father? There is another possibility also that leads directly to the dead and to Ulysses, which we will consider more fully in the next episode. Suffice to say here that Joyce's desperation in Rome began a process of reassessment of Ireland and the Irish that they had chosen to omit in Dubliners, and what he frankly missed in Rome: Ireland's hospitality, conversation, and especially its food, as we will see in Joyce's mouth-watering depiction of the Morecambe sisters groaning bored in the dead. Might Mr. Hunter, an agent of altruism in a Dublin previously depicted as heartless and selfish, did he amount to another reassessment? If Joyce intended to showcase Mr. Hunter's selfless humanity, he would be the first central character in a Dubliner story so characterized, and was Bloom, therefore, far behind. There's one final sense in which Rome was at work altering Joyce's perception of Ireland, the Irish, his life, and indeed the human condition. Specifically, Joyce never got past his initial impression of Rome. His eternal city was anything but. For Joyce, Rome was not timeless, but a mortuary, a city of the dead, and worse, a tourist trap of hawkers, touts, and swindlers living off the remains. On September 24th, Joyce made a return visit to the Forum. Sitting on a stone bench overlooking the ruins, he views carriages full of tourists, postcard sellers, medal sellers, photograph sellers. I was so moved that I almost fell asleep and had to rise brusquely. I went home sadly. Then Joyce delivers the coup de grace. Rome reminds me of a man who lives by exhibiting to travelers his grandmother's corpse. Joyce's ire is directed here at the grandson. The grandmother's corpse is another matter. More than any other city that Joyce had experienced, not Dublin, London, Paris, or Trieste, Rome was haunted by the past, with the proximity between the living and the dead frozen in stone. In that sense, the eternal city is a misnomer. It is not timeless, it's a time capsule. Had Joyce come down from his stone bench above the Forum, he could have walked on the same tile floors that Julius Caesar walked on. Filtering out the distracting vendors and gawkers, Joyce must have been struck by how the past was still living presence in Rome. He reminded Stanislaus, and no doubt underscoring his own recognition, that St. Peter himself is buried in the cathedral that bears his name. Patrick Kavanagh captures this well on Raglan Road when he writes, "On a quiet street where old ghosts meet, I see her walking now." Or Eugene O'Neill, "There is no present or future, only the past happening over and over again." Or William Faulkner, "The past is never dead, it's not even past." Joyce will add to this litany on the merging of the past and the present, and on the mutuality of the living and the dead, most memorably as his Roman-inspired The Dead fades to black. Rome would prompt Joyce's awareness of the rich and vital conversation between then and now. Why else did he decide to give his proposed story about Alfred Hunter the name Ulysses, imagining the simultaneity between a contemporary Dubliner and the great hero of Homer's ancient epic? If Rome could accommodate the tawdry present, the papal and Renaissance past, and the Roman Empire, so might Dublin's life be universalized and timeless. In Dubliners, Joyce set out to describe Dublin as, quote, the center of paralysis. Through his experience in Rome, Joyce recalibrated in what would become Ulysses to show Dublin as the center of everything, his version of the eternal city. He would later declare, "For myself, I always write about Dublin because if I can get to the heart of Dublin, I can get to the heart of all the cities in the world. In the particular is the universal." In the next episode, we will continue following Joyce in Rome, as his ideas for an additional story for Dubliners eventually lead him to write an alternate story, arguably the greatest short story ever written, while his original idea of a story involving the Dublin Jew and purported cuckold Alfred Hunter morphs into a novel-length sequel to Stephen Hero and an epical answer to the biographical novel he was struggling to complete. Thanks for listening. Thanks in particular to my supporters on Patreon who helped to make this podcast possible. If you listened and want to hear more, consider joining us on Ulysses in 100 Objects and 100 Episodes on Patreon. For a modest contribution of $5 a month, one trip to Starbucks, you will have access to a variety of exclusive content as well as all our next coming episodes. Again, thank you for listening.